for certain. And so anyway, Christopher, very warm welcome, and I think I'm going to hand straight over to you.
Well, Philip, thank you very much indeed. Can we give Philip a rollicking round of applause for having... goes in to organising these events. And Philip has been one of the very few in Britain who has got this genius for organisation, which I certainly don't have. And so to him and to all his fellow organisers, the very warmest of congratulations and many, many thanks. Well, now my topic today is really following on from what both Philip and Nicholas said this morning, which is Philip took you through a really very engaging presentation on the history and the science, and a very quick overview, as he said, just taking bits from here and there and putting them together into what amounts to a very compelling story. Nicholas introduced to you the notion of the International Independent Geoethics Committee to try to bring back into the sciences the necessary moral discipline without which science can become, and in the climate area has become, corrupted largely by government cash, and very greatly not only at taxpayers' expense, but at the expense of scientific truth and integrity. So when Nicholas and his colleagues decided to take the initiative of establishing the Independent Geoethics Committee, I, for one, was delighted and am very pleased and honoured to be part of it. And can we therefore please give Nicholas and all his team a round of applause. Now, I've been asked to talk about the climate of corruption in the science and economics and social policy of the climate topic. And we should just begin to pause for a moment to see what is already happening to free speech. We are lucky that we are still here and able to say what we are saying, because there are forces at work which would make it a criminal offence, punishment of indefinite imprisonment and possibly even death, for daring to say what we are saying among ourselves here today. Well, we reject any such attempts to silence us. We have seen before in the not too distant history of Europe, and this city was one of the victims of it, what happens when the truth is silenced in favour of pseudoscience, in that particular case the Nazi pseudoscience of eugenics. And we cannot go down that road again by not allowing free debate among scientists on where the truth actually lies. And Philippe Verdier, a perfectly good meteorologist, was sacked from his job as the leading TV meteorologist in France for one reason and one reason only, and that was that he had dared to publish a book which raised questions about the official storyline on the climate in the run-up to the Paris conference. They wanted him out of the way before that conference, and so they dismissed him. Of course, they found a footling bureaucratic pretext for dismissing him, but we all know what the real reason was. So he now becomes one of the heroes of what we might call the climate resistance. Can we give him a round of applause? And it's also a particular pleasure for me to say to our French allies and colleagues and friends, soyez les bienvenus. It's a real delight to meet the collectif, though that word makes me shiver a little bit, the collectif des climatorialistes. They're very welcome here. They're charming people and extremely knowledgeable, as they have already made it very plain in the earlier session this morning. And so we're very fortunate that they have come here too. So I'm going to look at, we're going to have to go right back to basics here, because I'm going to propose to you in a moment a way of bringing this whole nonsense cheaply, efficiently, and quite quickly to a stop. It's no longer any good just to say, oh, but the science says this and they don't understand it. They understand perfectly well what the science says. They know perfectly well there is no problem with the climate, as Nicholas himself put it this morning. They know this. And they know that we know it, which is why they want to silence us. because they're making a lot of money out of pretending that a problem that doesn't exist does exist. So we're going to go right back to the basic foundations on which all science is built. There is a thing called the question of questions. Does anybody know what it is? Well, I'll tell you. Here was the show trial at which that question was very publicly raised. It's the most famous show trial the world has known. And it took place in around 33 AD in an obscure corner of the Middle East, then an unconsidered part of the Roman Empire. And the principal players were the leaders of the Jewish religion, who are down here, and somebody dressed very similarly to them, Pontius Pilate, Rembrandt Hermanson von Dreen, who is the artist, is showing Pilate having effectively gone native in agreeing to the Jews pressing the staff of judgment on him. Notice that the Lord of life and light is in shadow, and the mere people are in shadow too, because at that show trial, as with the global warming thing, the governing class was at issue, and what it had to say about the truth. And here, in this rather nice painting of the same show trial, this by the Hungarian artist Mihai Munkaci, you see some unusual features, one of which is that Pilate is actually looking interested. Because this is the point at which Jesus was saying to him, ego in hoc natus sum. He probably said it in these words, in Latin, ego in hoc natus sum, et ad hoc veni in mundum, ut testimonium per hibeam veritati. To this end was I born, for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Now there, I put it to you, is a very good motto, which everyone in government service and every scientist should follow, that we should be in the service of the truth. And then, what happens next? Here is Pilate still looking interested. This is in a much, much older text. This is by Duccio di Buoninsegno. We're now very much into the early Renaissance here. And you can see from the hilarious attempts at perspective, particularly on the steps here, not matching with the wall at the back, that they were just beginning to experiment with perspective. It wasn't until the Florentine school really got going that they got that right. And you also see the influences of Byzantine iconography on these early Renaissance paintings. But here is Pilate putting the question of questions to the Lord of life. Quid est veritas? What is the truth? Now, the one thing that you will not find happening anywhere in that conference is the one thing that you didn't find happening in this trial. There is no interest among the governing class in the truth, and you see that particularly in this painting by Antonio Ciselli, broadly contemporary with Munkaci. Wonderful use of light and a wonderful use of composition, because we're looking at this from a completely different angle. We're looking at it from the government's eye view. The people are out there, you can see the massed crowds in the distance below the balcony there. The Lord of Life, again in shadow. And you see Mrs. Pilate here with her back turned to her husband, because she had told him earlier, if you remember the story, that this guy Jesus wasn't quite such a bad fellow after all. And she was indicating her disapproval. And here is the governor playing to the crowd, exactly as the 198 governments, however many it is, across the road in Le Bourget are doing, playing to the crowd, rather than concerning themselves with the truth. And Pilate, having raised this question, quid est veritas, what is the truth, didn't stay for an answer. He just went straight out and said to the people, do you want this man or do you want Bar Abbas? And they said, we want Bar Abbas to be set free and this man to be crucified. So this merely focuses our attention on the fact that there is such a thing as the truth, but that the governing class is very often unconcerned with it. And if we do not understand that, we are going to find it very difficult to bring this climate nonsense to an end. And my aim in this presentation will be to lay out to you very clearly and in some detail a method by which we can bring the climate scare to a complete and very rapid end. Now, what I'm going to have to do is, again, using the basic building block, we've established the concept that there is such a thing as absolute objective truth. Truth that is true whether you or I or anyone likes it to be true. And the mission of scientists in the field of the earth sciences is to try to find that truth, to answer that question. What is the truth? They're not there to play politics. They're not there to push propaganda. They're not there simply to get government grants and then say what the government wants them to say. They are there to pursue the truth. So I'm going to focus just for a few moments on what the truth actually is all about. As a matter of logic, and logic is that branch of philosophy which meditates most directly upon the distinction between truth and untruth. Here is what is known as the fundamental postulate of logic. You'll sometimes see this described, so fundamental is it, in the logic textbooks as a truism, something which is self-evidently true. But it's only true provided one accepts that there is a distinction between truth and falsehood. Now that, to anyone who is a believing Christian, as Philip Foster is, and as I am in my imperfect way, then it is axiomatic that there is such a thing as truth, and therefore there is such a thing as untruth. And the fundamental postulate of logic simply says that you cannot have a proposition P, a declarative statement of some kind, that is true and not true at the same time. That is impossible. It's either true or it isn't. Now, various very important corollaries of this can be drawn out. The first one is that any true proposition is consistent with every true proposition. And that is the universality of all truth. Now, of course, in various branches of mathematics and science, there are also probabilistic analyses. But we should nevertheless hold fast to the fact that any analysis, whether it's deterministic or probabilistic, is looking for the truth. We're trying to find the truth. So every true proposition is consistent with every other true proposition, but inconsistent with every false proposition. This is where it begins to become useful to us to have understood these very important, very simple concepts in the very foundations of what is known as formal logic. Now, another corollary of this fundamental postulate of logic, that a proposition and its converse cannot simultaneously obtain, is that you can demonstrate the truth of a proposition by contradicting it and then seeing if you can negate the contradiction. And in doing so, you establish the truth of the proposition. Now, I'm going to give you a demonstration of this. This is Euclid's demonstration that there is an infinitude of prime numbers. And it's stated in the terms of formal logic at the top there. You have the universal quantifier at the left. For all natural numbers n, there exists, that's the e upside down, some number, some nth number, which belongs to the set of all prime numbers. That's the proposition. Now, how do you prove that? Well, what Euclid did was he did a proof by contradiction. He negated it, first of all. So you state the converse. Well, so you get there exists some number n in the natural numbers, the whole numbers, for which there does not exist a prime number. So that's the converse. And then he said, right, now we're going to disprove the negated proposition, thereby establishing that the proposition, the original proposition, is true. And so he does it very simply. He says, all right, let's suppose there is an n for which there is no prime. Then you take all the various prime numbers up to the n-1th prime, and you multiply them together and add 1. And that's what this sum there. And you do that by definition. Say x equals, let x equal that. Now we know from the fundamental theorem of arithmetic that there is at least one prime divisor, which we'll call q, which exactly divides x without leaving a remainder. And we know that that is prime because it is prime by definition. But we also know that it must be greater than p n-1, because none of these prime numbers from p1 to p n-1 will divide x. So this prime, which we know must exist, is bigger than all the previous primes, and therefore that we can call the nth prime number, and so you can go on doing this indefinitely. There is therefore an infinitude of primes. And how did we do this? We did it simply by stating the proposition, but then negating it, stating the negated form, the converse as it's called in logic, and then proving the converse has to be false, and that establishes the original proposition is true. Now you may be wondering at this point, why the heck is he whittering on about logic and all this stuff about Euclid? Well, that's simply to demonstrate what it is that we're now going to do. Under the aegis of the International Committee on Geoethics, there again is the sword. We are establishing, and I have asked Niklas's permission to discuss this with you today, and to ask for the help of all of you in the work of this. We're establishing a fraud investigation team. And that fraud is, of course, the fraud that supports what Niklas called this morning the greatest lie ever told. We are going to be investigating certain specific frauds. And we are hoping to produce reports which, once they have been very carefully picked over, with all the evidence assembled and properly indexed, and looked at by the committee, we're going to do this very quietly. Those reports will then be sent to the prosecuting authorities in the countries concerned, under the names of as many distinguished scientists as well as the members of the committee as we can get to put those complaints in, so that the public authorities cannot just say, oh, it's some individual crackpot putting in a complaint, let's put it under the carpet. We want them to take this seriously, provided that we have done the homework and produced definite evidence that frauds really exist. And that is not going to be easy, and I don't pretend it is. Here's why. What is fraud? We're looking in particular at a species of fraud known to experts in this field as fraud by false representation. Now, the four necessary elements to establish that this fraud is present are that the accused made an untrue or misleading express or implicit representation, and it can be by a speech, it can be in writing, it can be on the internet, it can be in various ways. He must do so dishonestly, he must do so knowing that it is or may be untrue or misleading. And he must do it intending by the deception to make a gain for himself or for someone else, or to cause a loss or risk of loss to someone else. Those are the four elements that establish that a fraud by false representation exists. Now, what is a representation? A representation is any evidence, we have to have evidence for it, because otherwise there's no case, express or implicit representation to a person or even to a machine by word, deed, or omission as to fact or law, whether or not any recipient believed it, was affected by it, or acted on it, because it's the intention of the accused that establishes the offence. Now, fraud includes failure to correct a false impression after a change in circumstances following an earlier representation by the accused. So if, for instance, you were to make a prediction that there was going to be by now a certain amount of global warming, and the outturn on all measures turned out to be considerably less than that prediction, then your obligation is to make that fact very plain. And if you don't, then you can be held guilty of fraud. Now you begin to see why I have been so careful in establishing truth and untruth and how you do the proofs and so on. Now, what is a false representation? Representation is false if it's intentionally untrue or misleading, and the accused actually knows, rather than merely suspects, that it is or may be untrue or misleading. Now, that's actually quite a difficult formulation. I'm going to pick it apart a little bit. It's important that you should understand this, because I'm looking for your advice on how we proceed from here. Now, if the accused actually knows that what he is saying is untrue or misleading, and he intends to profit thereby, then that's definitely fraud. But what is this about he knows it rather than suspects it, but then he might know that it may be untrue? What's going on there? Isn't knowing that something may be untrue the same as suspecting it's untrue? No, it isn't. And the distinction is this, that in law, if you tell a lie, knowing that what you're saying is false. That's a lie. It's perjury if you do it under oath. But if you say that you know something is true, when you don't know that it's true, and it actually isn't true, that is just as big a lie, and that's what this phraseology, which comes from the British Crown Prosecution Service guidelines on fraud, that's where that comes from. So it's important you understand what is and is not a fraud. What is a gain and a loss? We've got to do that very briefly. Gain is keeping what one has or getting what one doesn't have. Loss is not getting what one might get or parting with what one has, whether temporary or permanent, in money or in any other real or personal, tangible or intangible property. And in most jurisdictions, you have to be able to attach some kind of monetary value to that. You have to be able to quantify the extent of the fraud. No gain or loss in the UK need actually be made. It is solely the intention of the accused that establishes the offence. Now we need to take a look now, what are and are not fraudsters. We can automatically rule out scientifically illiterate ministers, like the people who are turning up at this conference, not knowing what the heck's going on, but knowing what the party line is. That isn't fraud. It's stupid. It's expensive, but it isn't fraud. Scientists who are doing their best and just screwing up, that's not fraud either. You don't have to get things right as a scientist. Indeed, the whole purpose of science is to correct previous errors or defects or shortcomings in understanding. And so scientists are going to be wrong quite a lot of the time. It's not fraud to be wrong. As long as you've diligently tried to be right. And ignorant climate campaigners from these lavishly funded quangos and organisations that are doing marches all over the world and screeching at us because we dare to take a view and doing their best to damage our reputations. None of that's fraud. It's unpleasant being on the wrong end of it, just as it was in Nazi Germany when exactly the same kind of people did exactly the same kind of things to those who disagreed with the Nazis. It's the same in communist Russia and China. These are the same type of people, the people who are so sure that only their point of view should prevail, that they will go to any lengths, including recommending imprisonment, which 27% of all so-called Democrat voters have recently said that they would like to see us imprisoned for daring to raise any questions at all about their party line on the trial. So we're seeing this pattern emerging again, but that's not fraud. Wherever else it isn't fraud. Likewise, ill-educated journalists, and my goodness, we've all met plenty of them, they're not committing fraud. Right? It's not a fraud to be ill-educated. It's not even a fraud to be ill-educated and yet pretend that you are educated. People like George Monbiot fall into that category. These are what Lenin would have called useful idiots, and useful idiots are not fraudsters either. They are people who just go along with the party line because it's usually socially convenient, politically expedient, and above all financially profitable to them to do so. But that doesn't make them fraudsters. Now that narrows down the field quite a bit. A fraudster is a scientist who deliberately publishes or endorses or fails to correct methods or results they know are or may be false, intending to gain or to cause loss. Those are fraudsters. And it is those and only those that we will be looking at. And we will not be naming them publicly. There is a naming and shaming procedure which was described to you this morning by Nicholas Murner, which has our approval, and we're going to do that. But that is a separate exercise. And that we will not be saying that they're fraudsters publicly. Because if we did, that would be running a grave risk of actually making it harder to prosecute. This is going to be privately and quietly and responsibly done. So one of the things that fraud investigators do, because I used to do this for Her Majesty's government, is to look for what are called red flags. These are irregularities, a kind of atmosphere, climate of corruption, to use that phrase again, where there are things going wrong that shouldn't be going wrong. I'm going to flash through these quite quickly. These red flags, I'm not talking about the communist flags, because as far as I know, the only time that the communist flag has been seen in the streets since the Berlin Wall came down was at the Copenhagen Climate Conference a few years ago. So, but I'm not actually talking about the reds under or in the red here. A red flag is simply a warning flag, such as you have on a firing range. So if you see something irregular in the science or economics, that's a red flag. Here's one red flag. It's rather a nice example. I was giving a speech 5 years ago before the Copenhagen conference, and it attracted nearly 3 million hits on one website alone. Another 2 million hits scattered around other websites, and suddenly all hit counters stopped increasing, and I thought nothing of it. Well, that's everybody's seen it, wants to see it. But I got a phone call from Texas A&M University, from a professor there. He said, I monitor the internet. He said, what they've done is they've created a series of bogus internet pages, all of which have the taglines Monckton video, so that anybody looking for this video, being told by their friends, you've got to see this, will instead find these pages of gibberish, and pages of them. So there'll be 2 Google screenfuls of these pages of gibberish. And I said, but how can a page of gibberish, literally just dashes and dots and random strings of numbers and so forth, how could that attract enough hits for the search engines to pick those up before it picks up the video which has had 5 million hits? He said, oh, he said, that's quite easy, you pay. That's how Google makes its money, he said. They pay the search engines to get these pages of junk put up before this one so people can't find this one. It's a known trick, he said, and they've done it. He said, I've never seen it done on this scale before. All the search engines have done it. Yahoo, Bing, Google, he said, they've all done it. Of course, I'm a mere child. I'm the wrong generation. I'm not a 10-year-old kid. What do I know about anything? But this professor had studied it. And he said, this is what they've done. I said, well, it's cheap enough to set up a website, web page. It's not cost them much. As he said, that's not the point. It's paying Google to lift their little thing with 0 hits above something that's had 3 to 5 million hits. That's where the money comes in. And it's a lot. I said, how much? He said, somebody really, really, really did not want this particular video of my talk to the Minnesota Free Market Institute, warning them of the world government aspects of what they're doing here today. Really didn't want that to go viral. That was going to 20 million, he said. This was going to be far and away, that you were in Justin Bieber territory. This was going to be huge, he said. And they were determined to stop it. I said, how much did it cost? He said, I know a lot about this. He said, I can't tell you exactly how much it cost, but it will not have been less than $250,000 just to stop that one speech going viral. Right. That's a red flag. Because I was just exercising my right of free speech. I was saying, here, they're saying they want to establish a government. I don't like the idea of them establishing a government that I haven't elected. And they didn't want me to say that. And they were willing to pay $250,000 minimum. He said, that's an absolute minimum to stop that reaching out any further than it did. They don't treat both sides equally. You will have heard of the vicious campaign against my friend and academic colleague and co-author Willie Sue, who had received over a 10-year period $1 million in funding from a utility company in the United States, of which he only got, I think, $40,000 a year. The rest went to his institution. And that was to pay for his research into solar physics, which had only a peripheral effect on the climate debate. Joel Schwartz, on the other hand, got 31 million from the Environmental Protection Agency, from one source, and the paper that he wrote, and didn't disclose where he got the money from, didn't disclose he had any money from them, he was writing a paper saying how wonderful the EPA were and how correct their policy was of shutting down the coal industry in the United States. $31 million. This story of him not disclosing his 1 million, when in fact his institution had negotiated a contract with the funder so that neither they nor he was allowed to disclose who had funded it. That went all over the left-wing newspapers, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, Nature, Science, everybody had stories about him and his burger flippers money. 40 grand a year for 10 years, you could flip burgers and do better than that. This guy, $31 million from the very organisation he is praising to the skies in his paper, he doesn't disclose that. Not a word in any mainstream newspaper whatsoever. That contrast between how the news media are treating an innocent guy and a guilty one is a red flag. They don't tell us what the ideal global mean temperature is. What is it? Is it today's temperature? Is it the temperature as it prevailed 100 years ago, 250 years ago? What is the ideal temperature? And what are the variances either side of that within which there is no danger? At no point has the IPCC ever even addressed any such question. And how bizarre is that? It has now been addressed by Professor Richard Todd, and he has concluded that you could have 3.5 Celsius degrees of warming compared with today, and it would be net beneficial. Only beyond 3.5 Celsius might you get into negative territory, and even then he said it's questionable. And that paper has just been published. They should have done this, they didn't. Likewise, there are no performance indicators. You'd think they're making predictions about global temperature. Are those predictions coming true? If they don't come true for a certain length of time, and the outturn, the warming is far, far less than predicted, at what point do they themselves say, okay, we screwed up? They don't say. There is no performance indicator. There's none in that treaty. They say we're going to review the behaviour of countries in whether they comply with their pledges under the Paris Protocol every 5 years, and we're making a compulsory and legally binding review. But there's no review of whether the scientists have got the science right. That's a red flag. CO2 emissions are actually running above the rate originally predicted by the IPCC in 1990, and yet a minister on a radio programme with me a couple of years ago said that the reason why global temperature wasn't rising anymore was that we had got CO2 under control, a point that's been made several times by green groups since. The fact that they're saying that, when it's blatantly untrue, is a red flag. Then they say, well, the warming has gone hiding in the oceans, except that the rate of warming is equivalent only to 1 Celsius degree every 430 years. And the warming is coming from below, because the Argo bathythermographs that measure this warming measure it in strata. From 1.25 miles, that's 2 kilometres down, all the way to the surface, in layers of about 100 or 200 metres each. And the warming is coming from below. Inferentially, there may be some additional subsea volcanic activity along the mid-ocean divergence boundaries, but we don't know. What we do know is that if the warming was man-made, it would be coming from above. It would be coming from the atmosphere warming and warming the upper layer of the oceans, and the upper layers transferring the warming gradually down by various processes to the lower regions. The warming is instead coming the other way, and frankly, there isn't very much of it. And they don't tell us any of this, and that's a red flag. Then they certainly don't mention this pause in global warming, 1/3 of man's climate influence since 1750, using UN figures. And yet, this is the official satellite record from Remote Sensing Systems Incorporated. The UAH record is broadly similar. It shows no global warming for 13 years, 6 months. This shows 18 years, 6 months. This is 18 years, 9 months. And in their papers saying, well, of course there's no pause, they don't ever mention that the satellite record showed that there is. And that the satellite records showed that there was up until 2 years ago as well, as did the terrestrial records. And then in the run-up to Paris, all the 3 major terrestrial records, the Hadkrut 4, the GIS, and the NCDC, or NCEI as it is now, all of them tampered with their records to push the apparent rate of warming up, to do away with a pause that all of them had shown up until a couple of years ago. And the satellites have shown exactly the same as they showed a couple of years ago, and that difference between what the satellite records that haven't been tampered with show and what the 3 terrestrial records that have been tampered with show, that's a red flag. Then they try to deny the pause, and here is a famous example where we have the lower troposphere, as we've just seen on this slide. This is the lower, this is the air directly above the surface, up to a few miles up. That isn't warming. We've seen the ocean surface actually isn't warming. It's only lower down and from below that it's warming. There's no surface warming at all of the ocean in the 11 years in which we have a decent record. And yet somehow the surface between the air that isn't warming and the ocean surface that isn't warming is warming. Now that's a red flag in anybody's book. It's a repeal of the laws of thermodynamics. Then the various exaggerated predictions that were made. This is Hansen, a very early paper, I think 1981. There's the actual trend on the UAH satellite data compared with the predictions. Nobody else has ever gone and just put these predictions together with the observations. Here's another prediction by Hansen, the one that was influential in Congress in 1988. Another red flag. There's no way it's going according to what he said would happen. This is the stabilising CO2 in 2000 scenario. We haven't stabilised it. CO2, as you've just seen, is rising at slightly above the business as usual rate, and yet the temperature is rising at well below the rate we predicted it would. And here's a really interesting one. Nobody, until I did this just a few weeks ago, had ever done this. This is the original range of predictions by the IPCC in its first assessment report in 1990. And what it shows is a very rapid rate of warming that should have happened by now. 2015 is here. So that orange zone is their prediction. There is their central estimate of about 3/4 of a degree of warming that should have happened from 1990 to now. But the outturn is less than half of that. In fact, it's only a third if you go down to the 2 satellite data sets down here. On none of these 5 data sets, which are listed there, does the rate of warming since 1990 even come close to the very bottom of the range that they predicted in 1990. And you can bet that that graph will not be on the agenda at the conference that's going on today, and that's a red flag. Here are 33 IPCC models, and here is the RSS outturn. This was plotted by the people who keep the RSS dataset, Dr. Carl Mears. That's a red flag. Here are 73 models, every single one of which is predicting a bigger warmer of the vital tropical mid-troposphere than the 2 datasets, both of which coincide with one another, and are right down at the bottom here. And that's a very big red flag. Here's a Met Office model that's failed. Here are the most recent CMIP5 models. Again, here is the RSS data trailing along well below the entire range of prediction that they are making. So even the recent models are getting it wrong. Here is a postage stamp sized corner of a graph in the IPCC's latest 2013 assessment report. And you can see that even they, albeit the size of postage stamp, I had to enlarge it to show it to you, are showing a continuing discrepancy between observation in black and predictions on the CMIP3 and CMIP5 model generations. Here is the methane, and look at what's happened to this. They're still talking about methane being some terrible threat. That was the prediction in 1990, 1995, 2001, 2007. Here's the reality. And they took that graph out of the final draft of the IPCC's 2013 report because Germany and Hungary said if we print that graph, we will provide ammunition for skeptics. So they took the graph out and provided ammunition for skeptics. And here is another red flag. This is how the IPCC itself, without ever really saying so publicly, has reduced its medium-term projections of how much warming we're going to expect. The red zone overlapping into the yellow zone here, that was what they predicted in 1990. The green zone, this is up to 2050, the green zone, again overlapping with the yellow, that is what they now predict as of 2013. You can see that they pretty much halved the rate of near-term warming, but they have not actually been up front and said that they've done that, and that's a red flag. And then, of course, there's sea level, which is really, this is Niklas Mörner's expertise, so I'll be very brief on this, but this is a paper from Kazanov et al. To which he drew my attention, so I know about it. And this was the actual measured rate of so-called sea level rise. As you can see, it's in fact a decline from 2003 to about 2008. This is what was published because they had used a convenient thing called the glacial isostatic adjustment. Well, they said the land is still bouncing up after throwing off the weight of all that ice 10,000 years ago when the last ice age ended, and that means that if it weren't for that happening, sea level would be rising because of us, and so that's what we... Whatever you say about that, it isn't an actual sea level rise. That is the actual change. And that's a red flag. Then they say, oh, but water vapour is going to increase as the temperature gets warmer, and therefore this will enhance global warming. Except there is the trend in water vapour, none at all at most layers, and in the vital mid-troposphere, it's actually, if anything, declining. Not every record shows the same as this, but water vapour is a very difficult thing to measure in the atmosphere because it doesn't appear as a well-mixed greenhouse gas. It comes in pockets here and there, both latitudinally and altitudinally. But nevertheless, here is one of many records which actually don't show it increasing. And there is, of course, the very good correlation, again in some records only, between solar activity changes and temperature changes. This is one of the most long-standing and accurate records of its kind in the world. Again, not every record shows this. But the fact that some of them do suggests at least the possibility that it is, as it says here, the sun. And here is the gradual decline in climate sensitivity, the estimates of climate sensitivity. The range in green there is in my paper with Willie Soon and Dave Leegates and Matt Briggs, published in the Science Bulletin of the Chinese Academy of Sciences in January of this year. And that tallies with work done by Nick Lewis and Björn Stevens, and they show the probability density of various climate sensitivities, and they come out to the higher end of where we think it is. But this is a long way below the 3 to 3.3 Celsius, which is what the IPCC have been predicting. And so there's this decline in the various estimates of climate sensitivity. How much warming are we actually going to cause? This is declining in each successive bunch of papers. They're narrowing right down to clustering at or no, largely below 2 Celsius per doubling. Our own paper suggests more like kind of 1 Celsius per doubling, which really isn't a problem. And the fact that we're not being told this, and it's not being taken account of in these negotiations, and we're being told the science is ever more certain, when the science is ever more certain that they were wrong, that's a very big red flag. You can see here that there was much more all-time high temperature records in the United States in the 1930s than there is today. Well, that's very inconvenient. It's a red flag. Here is another one. Greenland actually increased its ice area, depth rather, at the higher altitudes, less around the coast, but more at high altitudes, for a 5 or 6 year period study. Henderson et al. The Danish Space Institute here. Hurricanes we've seen already, they're more or less unchanged. Cyclones ditto. Droughts, if anything, declining. This is the most comprehensive study that's ever been done of the area of the globe under drought, and it shows a gentle drift downwards. Not significant, but it's certainly not a deteriorating position on any view. But we're being told that droughts are getting worse or going to get worse. That's a red flag. Then rainfall, I think it's going to get worse. Here is the British record for 250 years. And we are now getting 2 inches or 5 centimetres more rain per year on average than we were getting 250 years ago. That's all it is. Then sea ice. Here is the official record of the sea ice extent and trend. If you had a heartbeat that regular, then you would be regarded as a very healthy little planet. There is really nothing to worry about in that. But they go on banging on about it, and that's a red flag. Then they don't tell you this, that annual extreme weather deaths have plummeted. This is from the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which is Nigel Lawson's group, run by Benny Kaiser. It's the one voice of sanity in the United Kingdom on the climate issue. It does formidably good work, and here is one of its slides. And then this is the kind of thing that goes on in the scientific journals. As you can see here, from about 1973 onwards, 69, you've got this sudden rapid increase in hydrogen. This, of course, is because of global warming, isn't it? Now, that was what they printed, and that was the full record that they had actually truncated so that they could make this entirely bogus case. That is a red flag. Then you see this is Stephen Goddard now, who does a wonderful work on the way they've tampered with the temperature records. That's what the records actually show, and this is what they did. They tampered with it, as you can see, mainly in the 1920s and 30s. They changed it so as to make it look as though what was in fact a falling temperature record in the United States is actually rising. Here we see the same thing with the GIS record. That's in 1999, the same record in 2008. And you'll see, particularly if you look at the 1930s and 40s, they pushed down the 1930s to try to make it look as though there were more warming in the 20th century than there was. That's a red flag. Here's the same thing happening in Darwin, where is this now? Darwin Airport, Australia. And there are many other records in Australia that have the same phenomenon of the actual data and then what got reported. You have the same thing here in New Zealand, which actually led to a rather inconclusive court case. And again, the NIWA, they're the organisation responsible, tampering with the data to make it look as though there was warming when actually there wasn't very much. Then you have the No More Himalayan Ice by 2035 scale, 25 years from now. And it turns out to be complete rubbish. How did I know? Because I checked with the guy who keeps the records, Professor Pat at the Indian Geological Survey. He said he was baffled when he saw that. He said there's absolutely no basis for it. We've got records going back 200 years to the days of the Raj, and the pattern of advance and retreat of the glaciers has always been stochastic. It shows absolutely no trend. So individual glaciers, yes, overall picture, no trend at all. And then they don't often mention, they do occasionally mention this, but the climate behaves as a chaotic object mathematically. Unless you know to a very high degree of precision exactly where you're starting from, you can't tell how it's going to evolve. If I were to change the numbers, the single number actually that generated this picture by a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of 1%, you get a completely different picture, and the climate behaves in the same way. And yet they tell us the science is settled. It can't be if you're modelling a chaotic object, and that's a red flag. Then they conveniently ignore, and they're ignoring it at this conference, that China's CO2 emissions are shooting off the chart. At this time, they were 28% of global emissions, but that was before it was realised they'd underreported them by 17%. So that takes it up to 33%. They're now already 1/3 of global emissions, and they are exempted from this process. Obama went there. They blew him out of the water in Copenhagen in 2009. And Wen Jiabao, who was then the state president of China, wouldn't do a deal with Obama to go along with the Copenhagen Treaty. And it was China that broke the treaty. And that's why they didn't get the treaty at that time. So this time, Obama goes to China in December last year and nobbles them and says, look, if we let you out of the process altogether, will you not please wreck it for the rest of us? We want to spread socialism worldwide, we're all communists together, just keep your heads down and we won't make it binding on you. And so China is exempted from this process, and they will soon be producing more than half, within the next 5 or 10 years, more than half of all CO2 emissions worldwide, and they're exempted from this process. Now that's a red flag. Then there's the ozone hole area. Here is the Montreal Protocol brought in 1992, and you can see the ozone depleters being put in the atmosphere, absolutely plummeted, and yet the most recent picture of the ozone hole in the Antarctic shows it at just about at its largest extent in the entire record. So perhaps they got the science wrong on that too. Then, of course, they failed to mention the enormous environmental damage. And it's actually exceptionally high amounts of damage if you express the damage as a number of kills per terawatt-hour generated, because these windmills don't generate very much electricity. In fact, you would need to produce the same amount as one good modern coal-fired power station, you would need a wind farm the size of the greater Paris area. So then there are red flags that are flawed. Here is one of the most notorious examples where they were trying to say the rate of global warming is accelerating and we are to blame. They've got all these trend lines correctly calculated, correctly presented, had proof data. But can you see what's wrong with this conclusion? They said that because this line here is steeper than all the others, and they get steeper and steeper the more you come to the present, therefore the rate of global warming is accelerating and we are to blame. Now, the logician would immediately object to the second part of that because that's a non sequitur. The fact that even if it were the case, you couldn't necessarily say it was us that was causing it just because it's happening. But in fact, let's look at what's really going on. Oops. There were two previous periods with exactly the same trend as the period they say is unprecedented. It isn't unprecedented. You can see it on the picture. I put down a question in the House of Lords about this, and the Minister had to admit that this graph was wrong. But he said, we're not going to change our policy just because of the facts.
And they're 60 years apart, you know. So you've got like another...
yeah, certainly.
They're 60 years apart, you see.
There is, exactly. That is, of course, the cycle of the Pacific Decadal and other ocean oscillations, which is exactly what you would expect. We would expect. They are, of course, baffled by this. Most of the models still don't take those oscillations properly into account. So that's a good point, Piers, thank you. And we can apply their technique to a sine wave. Now, a sine wave is a zero trend by definition. What we're going to do is correctly calculate 4 trend lines on this portion of the sine wave.
Oh, wow! Well, it's going up.
So there you are. Not only are they repealing the laws of thermodynamics, they're repealing the laws of arithmetic
But
as
you
well.
don't want to show the first half either, just chop it off earlier on.
Well, no, we're being fair. We're being very fair. And you notice they've even used the same colours we do.
Oh. Well, you use the
So,
same colour.
I mean, this is an outrageous red flag. I'll tell you why, because I wrote in my capacity as an expert reviewer of the IPCC, to the Secretariat saying, you've got to correct this graph because it's so bogus. And they said, no, we refuse to correct it. They couldn't defend it. They couldn't say it was right because it transparently isn't. Just put that in the seals. But they wouldn't correct it. Sorry.
Looks so good.
It does, doesn't it? Oh, yes. I mean, it's very sexy. And it was reproduced all over the place. This shows that, you know, our serious scientists have established that it's all our fault. It's total poppycock. So then, this is the 1995 IPCC report, where on 5 occasions said we can't find any human signaling global temperature, but when will that pathogenic effect be identified? It's not surprising the best answer to this question is we do not know. That was the pre-final draft. One man rewrote that entire document. He made 200 changes, single-handed, and without review by the IPCC reviewer. His name was Ben Santo of the Lawrence Livermore.
No, it's a post-final draft, is the one that finally got printed. the final draft was signed off by the people who rejected it.
Discernible human influence on global climate. Now, was he arrested for this? No, he was acting within the IPCC rules. He himself said so at the time. And he has recently been crowing about the fact that it was this sentence that finally put climate change on the map, and everybody's having to take it seriously.
Look what Santa brought
So if
back
anybody
Christmas.
ever asks you, oh, but isn't there a consensus? Oh, yes, there is. It consists of exactly one man. Well, then there's the hockey stick graph, which I don't really need to talk about here, except I will show this slide. It's a very interesting example. Because here you have, I decided to try and find a sea level record, reconstruction, going back 1,000 years, and I found one in Grimston et al. 2009. What it shows is that sea level has risen and fallen by a terrifying 0.2 metres either side of the long run trend over the last 1,000 years. And I thought, let's just put the two graphs together and see whether they map. This is Hubert Lamb's map, which you heard about this morning, of the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age, and today. And there is, it seems to me, at least a correlation there. Now, there is a reason why we would expect a correlation there, because they say that you get thermal expansion of seawater as it warms, and therefore you get a match. But that obviously doesn't match the hockey stick graph, or the hokey stick graph. So that's a red flag. Well, now then we're going to get on to the 3 frauds. Well, this is where it gets really interesting. First of all, the 97% consensus fraud. Most of you will already know this, so I'll take you through it very quickly. This was the definition of consensus in red there, just by the flag, that was in Cook et al. 2013. It was the consensus, effectively, that recent warming was mostly man-made. That's what they're saying there, in the kind of gibberish style that they write. But what they did was they found to their horror that only 64 out of 11,944 papers they read actually said that. So they reported this 0.5% consensus as a 97.1% consensus. And even after the mistake was pointed out to them and to the journal in which they published their results, no correction was made, and they went on saying it was a 97.1 consensus that most of the warming was man-made. That is, I'm going to call it what it is on this occasion, because this is me and not the committee speaking. That is fraud. Yep. It has been reported to police on 2 continents. On one of those continents, they actually looked at the evidence and they came back to our people there and they said, yes, a deception was definitely present, and they're now thinking about whether or not they're going to prosecute.
Wow.
So we are not taking prisoners here. We're going to go after these people and make them face the music if they dodge and bend the data. They were claiming they put out propaganda. There's the 97, that's their propaganda on the left. Here is the truth, that 99.7% didn't say what they said 97% did say. That's how bad this particular fraud is. Well, now we come to the central fraud, which is going to take a little bit of time. I hope I won't overrun my hour too much. Now, they say the science is settled, and yet look at the vast range of predictions of how much the world will warm in the 21st century. So what's going on here? Well, they have 4 different scenarios, the representative concentration pathways. And here are the different pathways. And there's a red flag because they're trying to say that on the worst of these, in 300 years' time, there will be 5 times as much CO2 in the atmosphere as there is today. Now, Murray Salvin will tell you, when you see his lecture, that in fact, even if you go just about doubling what we've got in the air today, there won't be enough affordably extractable fossil fuels to increase it any further. He may or may not be right, but the likelihood that we're going to see 5 times as much CO2 as today in 300 years is simply fanciful. I think we can rule out that particular scenario as a red flag. They're just desperate to maintain the notion that we're going to see lots of more. So now we're going to do the math to show just how much there is a fraud, and the central fraud that we're looking at here is that they know perfectly well that we're not now going to get anything like as much warming per doubling of CO2 or as much warming by the end of this century as they had originally predicted. And they are concealing that fact from the government here, and they're doing it deliberately. This is the central fraud, because if the warming is only as little as I'm going to show it to be, using their own arguments, then there is no need for any of this process. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the method I'm using, going back to that stuff about logic at the beginning, is we are using their own methods, their own data, their own arguments, just as we did with the Cook et al. Paper. We showed that that was fraudulent. So now we're able to show that what they're doing here, right at the centre of the whole scam, which is there's going to be this warming that they themselves know is not going to happen. Here goes. This is what's called the central equation of climate sensitivity. It simply says that the total warming is equal to the direct warming multiplied by a system gain factor, which allows for feedback amplification. And that's the area in red, the amplification effect. And there you'll see the sources on all this is all their mainstream science. And there are only 3 inputs to this equation so that you can get out the equilibrium warming on the left there. The first one you see there is the radiative forcing, as it's called. The next is the Planck climate sensitivity parameter. And the final thing is the feedback sum. You put those together in this order here, that will give you your total warming. That is how they do it. Now you may say, can it be really as simple as that? Well, yes it is. Here is the Planck sensitivity parameter. Here is how they derive it. This is the value they get. Subject to various concerns I have about this number, they are at least doing it broadly right, and my calculation here tallies with theirs. And I've gone to some trouble to get 30 years of satellite data for the mid-troposphere, which is the relevant point in the atmosphere that this applies, so as to calculate the Hurley inequality coefficient, and therefore to get a precise value. And it accords to 3 decimal places with theirs. So I think they've got that one right as far as it goes. And for present purposes, I'm not going to question it further, because we're using their arguments to show what amount of warming they would expect to get. So we'll take their figure as gospel. We're likewise going to take the radiative forcing at CO2 doubling as gospel for this purpose of this exercise. And again, we're simply going to agree with their value, which is shown on the screen there. Then we've got feedbacks. This is where it gets interesting. This is a graph from the 2013 IPCC report, AR5 as it's also known, Assessment Report 5, and it's comparing the estimates of feedbacks in AR4, which is the 2007 report, and AR5. And here is this little postage stamp sized area. This is where you want to look on these graphs. This is where they bury the information. They can't hide it all together. Let's enlarge that, because this is the total feedback sum. And here it is blown up. I've turned it round and enlarged it and enhanced it. We have the technology for the investigation team to do this. And here you see the figures, and what it shows, if we take the AR4 value, because we're going to calibrate that equation to make sure that we understand that what they're doing is what they're doing. And these are the feedback values that are the mean and extremes of, upper and lower bounds rather, of the interval of predictions in the various models of CMIP3, which was the generation of models for the 4th assessment report. That's the value. You just read it off the graph there. You couldn't read it off the postage stamp, you can read it off this. Now we can now calibrate this equation, the same equation, and this is calibration there, and we're looking at what they would have predicted, and they have published the CMIP3 figures, and there it is, the reference is there, and their range is 2.1 to 4.4 Celsius per doubling. That was what they put in the last IPCC report, and they've repeated it in this one, just referring back to it. And if we put the values that you see for each of these inputs to the equation there, then out comes 2.2 to 4.4 Kelvin. That is practically identical to what they say. In other words, we have understood this equation correctly. We are using their data and putting in their values and getting in something so close to their answer that we have understood this equation. This is how it actually works. So now let's look at what happens from here on. There, they were still playing it straight. But something happened between AR4 and AR5. And this is how you catch fraudsters. When they change their story, and they don't tell you they've changed. And here's what they've done. First of all, they've got this huge outlier here, this RCP 8.5. I showed you the forcings that generate that. It's basically nonsense. But, so we're going to take that out of the account. We're going to look at the RCP6, for which they only did runs up to 2100, which is this line here. So you see that kind of yellow mess on the graph. That's the RCP6 scenario. And they say that they're predicting 2.2, and again the range is 1.4 to 3.1 Celsius of global warming. This is not the equilibrium warming. This is the warming they expect to see between now and 2100. And that, remember that figure, 2.2 is their central estimate of the amount of warming on RCP6, which is the most realistic of the four scenarios, I think. I mean, we could have used our RCP 4.5, but even here, the actual temperatures are rising far more slowly than they predicted they would, even on 4.5, where there would have been very savage cuts in CO2 emissions, which are not going to happen, by the way, not with China and India and other big countries continuing to do it without restriction. So the amount of forcing they predict between now and 2100 is about 2.75 watts per square metre. That's the anthropogenic forcings of all sorts. That's your delta F, the green figure. Now we have another look at this very revealing feedback chart, because they've changed, much reduced the values of the feedbacks. Here was the range in AR4, but now all of them except this outlier, which is a French one, and has been, I think, retained purely for the purpose of allowing that RCP 8.5 to look so big, because the top half of that comes just from that one model. If you take out that one model, well, no, even if you leave it in, sorry, then you get AR5 is 1.53. This is the new feedback sum, F. It comes down in value. It comes down a little more if you allow for this outlier. And here I've rescaled it to show the climate sensitivity in response to these feedbacks. If you overstate the feedbacks, it very greatly overstates the climate sensitivity for reasons I don't have time to explain to you today, but will in question if you ask. And so I'm confining my analysis to that group there, which represents the current best estimate. I'm going to exclude this monstrous outlier as being absurd. And that gives you your feedback sum F of 1.47 between 1 and 1.83 watts per square metre per Kelvin. Now, here's the thing. They've made that huge reduction from 1.93 to 1.47, from 2 to 1.5 in round numbers, watts per square metre per Kelvin. Big reduction. So how much have they reduced the 3.3 Celsius of climate sensitivity in the IPCC's draft? Well, no best estimate suddenly can be given. They know perfectly well what happens if you reduce the feedback sum, as the models which they are quoting have done. But they have not been willing to say so. And that is fraud. You saw how I defined fraud earlier. If you don't say that circumstances have changed when you should say, that is fraud. So the IPCC, somebody there, and we will find out who, has committed fraud by not revealing that climate sensitivity should have come down, if you calculate it, to 2.1, not 3.3, as it originally was. And you can see that the ranges, again, are, this is the trend. Actually, it's not climate, this is not equilibrium, this is, yes, it is, doubling of CO2, that's right. And then you get just the 21st century figure. You've got 1.6 Celsius now would be the central estimate of equilibrium sensitivity to the 2.75 watts per square metre of radiative forcing that they project for the 21st century, if you use the lower values here of the feedback sum that they themselves have gone for. But that's the equilibrium sensitivity to the 21st century forcing, but we don't get equilibrium sensitivity instantaneously. there's your comparison. Equilibrium sensitivity, there's their forecast. Here is of what will happen in the 21st century. The equilibrium sensitivity looks like this, but in fact, only about 2/3 of equilibrium sensitivity comes through in the first 100 years on their own analysis. So that brings you down already to 1 Celsius as the central estimate of the warming that they would expect, not 2.2, but there's more. The forcing doesn't all occur today. It takes time to build up. You have a little bit this year, a little bit more next year, and so on. That approximately halves the total amount of warming that you will get by the end of this century. 0.5. That, or thereby, it might be 0.6, 0.7, I'm not going to quibble, but it's going to be there or thereabouts. That is the amount of warming that they would expect using all of this is their mainstream methods. There's nothing innovative in this, there's nothing where I've invented some fancy theory. This is their methods and their data. That is the amount of warming they should be telling these governments they expect. But they are making a figure 4.5 times greater than that. And the same applies to all the other RCPs. And that, like it or not, is fraud, because we've used their methods, and if we can see this, it takes a lot of digging to see it, admittedly, then those who put this together knew perfectly well what they were doing. They have deliberately concealed from governments that is all the warming they're expecting this century. That is a very serious and extremely expensive fraud. It's probably the biggest fraud that's ever perpetrated. Here, it is on their range of predictions. It's way down here. And here are the different variabilities. You can see the different forecasts they made of the second assessment report in 1995 with the worst of them. Then you've got the current central estimate here. But in fact, if you take out just that one outlier, look how the central estimate comes crashing down. Just that one outlier model causes this. And then if you exclude that outlier, that brings you down to here. If you exclude the overstatement of feedbacks, then it could even come down to sensitivity down here, or where Dick Linson thinks it is, right down here. Now, as a central economic fraud as well, I don't have time for that today. So what I am going to do is to wind this up very quickly, because I've now taken my hour, and to say that I think we should want various outcomes from this conference. One, it is no longer satisfactory to us who were born in democracies that our governments should hand over to an unelected global authority the power that we elect them to exercise on our behalf. So we require a proper democratic body to be established to run this global government or global arrangement, whatever it is.
Accountable.
And if we don't get it elected, then no power goes to it. And the United Kingdom Independence Party will repudiate, and we'll say this clearly now, will repudiate any purported agreement in which we agree to hand over our powers in this matter to any body overseas that is not elected by us to exercise that power. That's point one. Point two, there has now got to be a secession clause. I'm glad to say we did manage to get one written into the last two drafts of the treaty. They will try to take it out. I'm hoping it will remain. The secession clause gives any country the right to give a year's notice and then have no further obligations whatsoever under this agreement. That is in the draft at the moment, but the left are manoeuvring to get it taken out. I suspect they will succeed. Once again, we will repudiate any treaty or agreement which does not include a secession clause, giving countries the right, as they wake up to what we've shown you here, to change their view. And I think the third thing we want to include in that treaty is a performance indicator. I think we've got to say that if in any 20-year period, from 2000 onwards, the average of any two of the major global temperature data sets shows a rate of warming of less than 0.15 Celsius per century, per decade, I think I've said, then we will simply, the entire treaty will collapse. Every obligation will disappear, every organisation set out under it will disappear. There's got to be a performance indicator, some level, I can't specify what, but I have my own ideas on this, at which if the temperatures don't rise as they said they would, then you cut the whole process away. Is that unreasonable? Surely not. If they're so confident the temperature's going to rise, they can't get it. That's what's nice about that one. So those are the three things that I would put into the treaty. The democratic provision, the secession clause and the sunset clause. And with that, I'll say, God bless you all. Thank you for listening to what has been a very detailed and complex presentation after what I'm sure was a very good Parisian lunch. God bless you. Questions, of course, yes.
For a few minutes.
I'll leave into my own time because I'm next. But
Oh, you're next.
if there is no clause that allows them to get out, like in Kyoto, because of course Canada used that clause to get out,
Yes.
can't they go back to the FCCC clause that says they can get out of the whole thing, including everything generated from the FCCC?
They can try, but the left are aware of that one and they're trying to block it all off. They're trying to get people to...
So we want to rewrite the FCCC.
They're trying to have a get-out clause from the FCCC in the present treaty. They haven't got away with it yet, they're trying.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Any further questions, or are you so completely stunned? Yes.
Yes, Viscount, as I say in America. I agree with your three demands. I think they're very important because well, you have to support accountability, right? But on your science, I have to say, my opinion of so-called radiative forcing is that the whole science of that is a nonsense.
You're right. May I answer that point straight away before you begin any further? And that is that I was at the World Federation of Scientists annual conference where I do a presentation each year at their invitation. And there was another presentation, I'm not really entitled to say by who, but it was one of the most eminent physicists on the planet, let's put it no stronger than that. And he said that the radiative forcing has been overestimated by 40%. That's the CO2 radiative forcing in particular, which of course is the big one. That's the big enchilada in all this. Because the modelers had said, oh, how do we model the interactions between the photons at the relevant absorption bands of CO2 and the CO2 molecule to set up the quantum oscillation, which is by definition heat. You're turning on a little radiator. How do we model that? So they used existing equations taken from other areas of optical physics. They used the Lorentzian and the Voigt line shape equation to model this scattering and how it works. The problem with the Lorentzian and Voigt equations is that where they came from, what they were invented for was laser physics, etc. And there, those equations are absolutely fine because it doesn't matter over what time scale the interactions occur. However, it does matter when you're trying to estimate radiative forcing from those interactions, because the equations assume that the excitation and de-excitation collision, which causes the oscillation and causes the warming, happens instantaneously. That's what the equations say. But actually, in real life, there is a delay of only a few picoseconds. And a picosecond is a very small fraction of a second. And because of that delay, according to this presentation, I say by a physicist so eminent that it's very unlikely that he will be found to be wrong. He's a very, very careful man. He says that they've overestimated the radiative forcing from CO2 by approximately 40%. So that would take you down from, say, 0.5 Celsius warming this century to 0.3, 0.4. I mean, because there's so little anyway, it doesn't make much difference. But in the longer term, a 40% overstatement of climate sensitivity comes through to something very like a 40% overstatement in the final warming you're getting 300 years' time. And there it makes a very big difference. So this is an extremely important point that you raised, and I dare say that was the point you were going to.
Well, if I could finish the sentence.
Now you can.
That's good, but that I don't think that is another way of representing what I actually think, although it could be, is that the whole idea of this radiative forcing is a nonsense, and I could discuss in more detail when I speak. But I just want to ask about evidence for that, because the way you present it is, all right, they've got these parameters and they're just using a standard, it's an electronics equation for amplification, right? They're using that, and then you were saying, well, they've now revised the parameters in there, and if they revise them, they should get something else, and they're not telling us what they should get.
That's the only way you can get them to fraud. You see,
Yeah,
if you can't
that's
say there's a different scientific theory,
that
then
is the fraud.
you can't get
That is the fraud. But I want to ask you about actual evidence of what is going on, because the evidence of what is going on is there is no response whatsoever to increased CO2, which I could explain, in various ways. But do you agree that that is a fact? There's no response whatsoever.
Well, that's why I showed that graph.
Yeah.
18 years
So
and 9 months
the
with no
idea
level
that
control, yeah.
either there's less than there should be, or well, the idea there's less than there should be isn't quite right. I would say there shouldn't be any, and the observation shows there shouldn't be any. Do you agree with the fact the observations show there is none?
Well, they showed no warming for 18 years, 7 months if you take the average of the two.
No, your theory
satellite.
should say that there should have been, and it should be 40% of some other thing.
Yeah,
but there isn't any.
Can I, wait, I'll just finish off here, I'll come back to you. The point is this, that it is possible that countervailing negative natural forcings are to some extent offsetting the forcing that they would expect. But that isn't relevant for present purposes, because in order to nail folk for fraud, you can't come on and say my scientific theory is
I agree with the
yours.
fraud attack.
You've got to say this is the scientific theory you are using, and if you use your parameters in your equations, this is the answer you get, but that is the answer you report. It's 4.5 times too big, and that's a lie, and you know it.
I agree.
And that's how you get them. Now,
You're
I quite
attacking
understand
the fraud on a false theory.
I quite understand
They've got
that
committed
the
fraud on a
theory
false.
itself has many holes in it, of which I've just mentioned one, you've just mentioned another. But for today's discussion, I don't want to take too much of Tom Harris's time away from it. I think we ought to contain ourselves on that. Now, Nick,
I was going to say exactly what you said.
oh, then that's fine. Any other questions? No other questions? Thank you very much. Tom, please.
Brilliant use of red flags, by the way. That's really stunning.